Ok, ci siamo? Allora,
So here is Professor Vincenzo Soresi, a pathology anatomist, oncologist, and pneumologist. He used to be a lecturer, professor, head doctor at the Niguarda Hospital, and emeritus professor. And he has been working with PNEI. And he will talk about his work and how human body can interact with mind and how emotions make a difference. And he will talk about the theme which will be developed throughout the day until tonight. The lecture from Dabral on yoga won't be held from Pavlich. So we have Pavlich instead. We'll talk about the miracles of zeolitis. So the topic is different, but having Pavlich here is a great honor, and that's the first time that he comes here in Italy. So I give the floor to Professor Soresi, and enjoy. So can you please take a seat because we are late? So good morning. Thanks to Di Modugno for this invitation. I start with my book, which I published in 2005. The cover changed in 2011 for a gallery on brain in Milan. This book starts, so the anarchic brain starts from a friendship with Galimberti professor, because he believed that medicine deals only with organs and not with humankind as a totality. And Galimberti in the 80s, I followed him to make him quit from smoking. And since I believe that thanks to PNEI, our body keeps communicating in a network, he suggested me that I should write this book. And so I wrote this book for UTET. And I started writing about my personal path towards the PNEI. This is Niguarda Hospital, where I started working in the 66 as a pathology anatomist. I worked as a pathologist for 3 years, and then I started with pneumology, which was my goal because I'm a physiologist's son. As a pathologist, I dealt with a new topic, which was brain. And as I had studied it in the 60s, it was not that well known, especially the prefrontal region's activity. The prefrontal regions are our orchestra leaders, so there is this book by Damasio, who is a Portuguese neurophysiologist. He believes there is no rational action independent of emotions, and he wrote those topics in Descartes' Error, Emotion, Reason, and Human Brain, which is a book in 1995. So our decisions are affected by both the prefrontal brain regions. Gazzaniga is an American neurophysiologist that deals with this topic in his work. And those are the improvements that we didn't know at the time, but many works helped me to understand new developments. This book is from Goldberg, who escaped Russia in the 60s. He went to the US and he became the biggest, greatest expert of frontal lobes. And in the 80s, he published a book in which he believed that the right hemisphere is much more developed and can spread it into the left hemisphere. And then they can cooperate much better. In the 90s, thanks to the MRI, we could prove what he said, that is to say, the right part of the brain is more activated rather than the left one. And after a month, we can see the prevalence of the left hemisphere. Michelangelo had already understood probably the importance of the prefrontal lobes, since you can see that this brain is kind of the same in the painting. And this whole path, according to an English expert, suggests that Michelangelo had already understood this. He is among the 100 most important scientists in the world who found out many things, among which stem cells that were targeted to the olfactive sensory organ. He said, no, they are used in that part of the brain that is activated. And thanks to an engram, we can improve our hippocampus and learn new activities. The learning is a never-ending process. And so here we go to the PNEI. PNEI starts from a lung cancer. In the 70s, I started working at Niwagda from pathologist. I became pneumologist. Tuberculosis was decreasing and lung cancer was increasing. Many patients could undergo surgery, but many couldn't as well. Among those tumors, there was the microcytoma, which had very singular characteristics. That is to say, had a good answer to chemotherapy. So there were not many aggressive drugs at the time for that disease. Anyhow, the results were significant, and we had 50% reduction of the cancer. So the neuroendocrine structure could actually heal, but that was not true. It actually developed metastasis. The neuroendocrine tissues has another characteristic. And the characteristic of this tumor is that it can develop any type of disease. That is to say, that a disease such as an autoimmune was due to neuroendocrine tissue which had been altered by the tumor. The discovery of the neuroendocrine system was very useful to me in the 20th century. So what are the neuroendocrine cells? Are widespread. They have granula that store peptide proteins. And on their surface, they have receptors. But what are neurotransmitters? Are cytokines, such as TNF. Cytokines are interleukin, tumor necrosis factor, and so on. They are messengers. All these substances make cells communicate. And what's the feature of the cytokines? Interleukins activate the inflammation. And I had a patient who suffered from inflammation, and this disease started increasing until I discovered that she was under chronic stress. I couldn't take her out from this phase, but after 2 years, I visited her at home, and she said that she was doing well, that she had separated from her husband, and that she was attending church. So stress would affect her body, producing interleukins and activating the inflammation, that is to say, the disease. Another patient of mine from South Italy, at a certain time, her son left her to move to Mexico, and she underwent stress, and her knee started swelling. And this inflammation set on due to interleukins, and she had to undergo surgeries. And you see how this can affect our body and develop diseases. So this is the other system, which is the immune system, which is part of the PNEI. I believed that the acquired immunity was at the base of the whole immunity, while I believe that the innate immune system was not that important. But a few months ago, I went to a lecture by Jules Hoffmann, a Nobel Prize because of his studies on immunity from insects. So innate immunity is the system that defends us from anything we get in touch with since we are born. He is a Russian biologist, Mekhinov, and he discovered throughout his studies some very important cells that are the main cells of the immune system, that is to say the macrophage cell and the natural killer. They are specific lymphocytes killing tumor cells. The macrophage engulfs germs and bacteria, producing bleach and killing the germ. And his DNA destroys the whole germ. And this happens every day. He sacrifices himself for our body, and it is developed by bacteria. Natural killer is instead a lymphocyte that destroys cancer cells throughout our body. Because there is a membrane protein within the tumor cell telling the natural killer that has to be destroyed, and the tumor produces the PGL1 protein throughout the immune system acts, and those are the latest discoveries. So PG1 is like a mask for the immune system. And an antibody has been produced based on PG1 against lung cancer and melanoma. So eliminating this PG1, we can improve the effect of the immune system, but as well with PGL1. So the new oncology is the immune oncology. Those two antibodies can trigger significant results. And he is Irish, and he discovered the acquired immunity, and this is a lymphocyte. And we would pick samples of ill blood under a culture, adding some other extracts. And the lymphocyte would recognize the antigen, activate, and produce antibodies. So when you undergo a vaccine, you actually produce antibodies that actually will ever remember the germ. And the response index mirrors the effectiveness of the immune system. And when we have to transplant an organ, we have to avoid rejection. And so this is the same mechanism. So the lymphocytes also helps releasing hypophysis hormones. So when we produce, when we are ill, we produce growth hormone, for example. This is a totally new biological word, and this was discovered just yesterday. And you can see how medicine is low. Balok is the one who actually develops PNEI, which is interaction between nervous system, endocrine system, immune system. But the nervous system acts, so that is to say, the brain, which are very important in our body. The amygdala is very important in directing the other system. What is the placebo effect? Is a spontaneous response towards an expected event. That is to say, a tablet. When we get tablets in our head, we actually would have the same effect with an iron tablet. That's for 50% of the cases. So placebo effect is a method throughout which study the effectiveness of drugs. Placebo is no, we don't want to deceive the patient, but we would just want to measure the results. And so we get it throughout genes, as if. So actually, the present drugs work if our body can answer placebo tablets. Placebo. In my book, there is a nice story about placebo effect. So one night, I saw at the TV a terminally ill person who loved Mother Teresa. He was visited by her, and he actually healed. And we can see that melanoma is a very antigenic tumor. But the antigen is that aggressive that it paralyzes the immune system. So antibodies do not have any effect. So the expectation, faith from the patient, release of cytokines as a consequence, and the interferon makes the antigen work better, leading towards to spontaneously heal. A friend of mine had a kidney metastatic tumor. And we know that eliminating the central part, the metastases do not disappear because so he underwent surgery, and after 2 months, he still had metastasis. So an oncologist at Niguarda administered him interferon for 3 months. So he underwent this therapy. And after 3 months, we checked him, and he was healed. After 22 years, he's completely healed. So while the protocol could heal only 2% of the cases. And now you see how miracles are so linked with our body. Unfortunately, there is no nocebo effect as well, which I describe in my book. A Delphi publisher one night called me, and here she was a lady, a 50-year-old lady, which was very angry, and she smoked, and she had a lymphoma. and she was terminally ill in the 70s. And she told me that I should have told it to her husband because he would affect her with stress. And she believed, she was sure that this stress had led the tumor to develop. And as I did it, he started crying. And unfortunately, she died in 6 months. So the relation of psychosomatic is made of the interplay of all those factors. But I used to deal with asthma as well. And it's the link between asthma and psychic factories is very important. So I had this patient who suffered from asthma, and at a certain point, I didn't see him for 3 months until he came again, and he believed to be good again. And he believed that thanks to that, that he had been jinxed. And he was actually psychotic, so that when he wasn't keeping this psychotic disease in control, he would get ill. So
he was allergic to his cat, and this naturopath managed to convince him that he was allergic to his dog. And so he managed to heal. I tried this with something I'm allergic to, but nothing changed. So at the end of my book, there is a sentence by Antiphon 300 before Christ who tells, "In the judgment of all men, the mind rules the body in health and disease as in everything else." And this is how I closed my book. Then I read in 2008 a book by an Oxford psychoanalyst who is called Sue Gerard, and she used to take a newborn and children, 1-year-old children, and work with them. And she says that the psychic discomfort of these children should be ascribed to a bad structure of the brain. So after reading this book, I decided to get into more detail into a concept, a particular concept, that is to say, the evolution of the brain. When we are born, our brain is not clearly defined, and it weighs really less than when it is completely formed. However, there's also an environmental interactivity with our brain and what happens in the external environment. For example, everything can happen. Let's think about a sort of industry where everything can happen. So we could also see a sort of suicide, of organ suicide, which is triggered by apoptosis. And 50% of our brain neurons should commit a suicide, and they do that triggered by specific signals. Then we have a neural plasticity with the synapses and the neuron differentiation. For example, we have the differentiation in neurons. And for example, the neuron which is responsible for our sense of sight. And if these neurons doesn't work, children cannot see. And this happens in the first stages of cell differentiation. It is a complex mechanism which brings to the construction, to the formation of brain, and which is correlated with the environment. So if the environment is not harmonic, also the brain development is not actually good. Then we have the position of synapses. You can see the different number of synapses at different ages. And there's a history described by the so-called connectome goes on, and we'll see it later. In these 3 years, I concentrated on limbic structures, that is to say hypothalamus and amygdala, that is to say everything which concerns emotional, whereas hippocampus, which is related to explicit memory, arrives only later. So this emotional world is something we have no consciousness of. An Italian scientist who published a book, researched the theme of implicit memory, and also the Korsakoff syndrome was discovered in this sector, in this field. What happens when the brain forms? 3 fundamental steps: stress tolerance, placebo effect, and resiliency. In these years, we actually build this potentiality in our relationship with the external environment. And why did I read this book? Because in 2006, I received an email from England, and a boy who was 36 years old had a particular tumor. So I told him to come to me with a tumor of the pleura, and it was a death sentence. But I fought with him for 8 years. Chemotherapy, radical surgery of lung, post-surgery radiotherapy, dendrites therapy in Germany. I did everything I could, but after 8 years he died anyway. And what failed him? Resiliency, which is the capacity of living with this deadly illness. And he managed to survive for 8 years, right, because he had this resiliency. And orphans have a higher resiliency by 50%, and they have greater success in life. This is what I was talking about before. This is connectome, which is what actually represents our true biological individuality. We have a lot of genes which are represented by the genome, but the connectome is the last discovery of the scientific field. The connectome represents all the biological basis which represents our true biological identity. The future in the research field could be a sort of connectome computer where this biological basis is stored. I read this book in 2004, written by Candace Pert, who at 28 years old managed to find out opioid receptors, and working with the radiotherapy and methadone, she managed to detect opioid receptors. She wrote a lot of books, but this book, which is Molecules of Emotions, Why You Feel the Way You Do, is an important book about receptors. So she says if opioid receptors are there on neurons, there will also be opioids, and there are some beta endorphins which work and communicate with opioid receptors. If the communication in the system is good, everything is harmonic. But if this system doesn't work well, we are depressed. There are about 70 neuropeptide connections, and in my last book I tell the history of an Italian singer who is Mango, who died because of an heart attack during a concert. But his 2 brothers were saved because they 2 days later, because they had a Y neuropeptide which managed to play an important role in saving them. So you can see how we can have different interpretation of illnesses and diseases. You can see this image taken from an electronic microscope, and you can see that these receptors are ready to receive the signals. You know, there aren't 70 receptors for 70 neuropeptides. The receptor becomes specific when it receives the neuropeptide, and it becomes specific in order to communicate with it. And this is how it develops. And it is no linear evolution. We have an evolution together with a development, because we have a gene pool which codifies better for a certain kind of organ. And this is basically turning everything around. This is a clinical case which happened to me. A girl who suffers from anorexia, and it is a classic illness, a classic disease, where our unconscious tells us that we don't have to exist, that we couldn't exist. And this girl tolerated nothing, so no therapy was possible. There was papillomavirus, there was no biological answer, there was no defenses. I had previously got in touch with a foreign surgeon, and he analyzed together with me the receptors taken from the exams of this girl. All the red points are hormone receptors, and they are pro-inflammatory cytokines which bombard the receptors and induce stress, a stressful condition, inhibiting the activity of the hormones. So hormones cannot cannot communicate with receptors. The same physician brought to me this scientific work, which you can see in the slide, and he was talking about peptides, neuropeptides, receptors. I received 15 different preparations for the cost of 90,000 euros, and these anti-inflammatory peptides were injected once every 3 weeks, and the girl I was treating is now tolerating every single hormone. So this is a classic study of a psychogenic illness, which is actually a biological disease correlated to a stress condition. And this is the stress I'm talking about. And why is stress important? Because I could also be born already stressed, because of epigenetics. What is epigenetics? Let's make an example. This is a mouse which was selected to be obese. If this obese mouse becomes pregnant and receives a particular preparation, I stabilize the protein. I don't stabilize the protein which is responsible for obesity, and the progeny of this mouse will be born without being obese, in a normal condition. So according to the protein you activate, we can have different conditions. And we could be unlucky because we could be born already stressed. And why? Because I can inherit. There are children who inherit stress because of a methylation flow. Some days ago, I visited a man who is 70 years old and who is depressed, and he is the son of depressed people. There is nothing which can help me because he inherited that there's a stress. And how can we help our biological defense? I discovered it some years ago. Mindfulness is a meditation technique which tries to penetrate the biological ego. We are conscious that we can manage ourselves, and the only possibility of having self-awareness is to pay more attention to ourselves to a series of clever tricks which could help us. And we need to pay attention to ourselves. And meditation can help us to do this. And now I'm going to talk about the last discovery of medicine. During a gastroenterology congress, they were talking about microbiome and microbiote. Microbiote is a gene pool which we have in our intestine, and it corresponds to 1.5 kilograms of genes. It can condition our DNA, it can condition our life, and it is a discovery which is revolutionating medicine. We could be depressed because our microbiota is not adequate. And the Copernican revolution is the study of this microbiota. And with a feces transplant in the USA, some children affected by gastroenteritis were healed thanks to a cryonised capsule of feces, and the feces transplant can be used in this case, and it is really important to analyze this radical change in medicine. This is one of the works in the last years, and it is the relationship between the brain and the microbiota. We could also be hungry during the night because we have an inadequate microbiome. So it is the body which conditions the mind. And there's a sentence by Nietzsche: there is more reason in your body than in your best wisdom. And I would like to conclude with this sentence by Nietzsche. Then a last flash on my last book, which is about the mitochondria, which is a bacterium living 2 million years ago. And when the oxygen reaches 21%, it develops a particular conditions. 3 years ago, I read a fantastic article, and it analyzed the case of 60-year-old people compared to 16-year-old people. And thanks to a particular study, these old people managed to have a similar mitochondria which was similar to that of the young people, and this thanks to a particular physical training. So fitness is fundamental, and every heart cell possesses 5,000 mitochondrial cells, which means that the more you are fit, the fitter you are, the better is your condition. And this is why I'm writing this book. The last studies made in IO in oncology so that women which were operated presented different conditions whether they were fitter or not. And why? Because we produce oxygen, and tumor cells suffer because of oxygen, because these cells have sugar. Thanks, everybody.
Grazie mille, professor Soresi.
Grazie.
Quindi ci si può ammalare, si può gestire la malattia e si può anche dare avvio ai processi di autoguarigione occupandosi di sé in vari modi, giusto? Ok. Allora, ringraziamo tanto il professor Soresi e